that you can hear me properly. In all honesty, I did not test the setup today, so I'm not sure if it's working, but I hope it is. Hope everyone's having a good Saturday, good weekend. Last week was kind of a hellish week with midterms and such, so I'm just gonna get some water and we'll start soon. Watching, so no pressure today, I guess. I just really hope my mic's working. Oh my god. Ugh. Okay, I think we'll get started. Yeah, so this week we're going to be learning about something really important in production generally, and that is compression. I'm just gonna keep checking that my mic is working. Yes. Okay, cool. So yeah, compression is like a need to know, you know. It's something that is a necessity for producers. So I've just brought in a couple samples here. This is what was playing during the intro. And that's what we're going to be using to talk about compression. So basically compression, how do I describe it? It's basically taking like all of the levels of your sound and compressing them. Wow, that's a great description. Like flattening them almost. Like they're bringing all of the, hopefully I'm not too loud. Oh my god. It was showing that I was like clipping for a sec there. Sorry everybody. Can anyone hear me? Can someone let me know in the chat if the audio sounds okay? I think someone is in here. Hopefully. If not, I'm just gonna assume it's fine and keep going. So yeah, compression. It's basically like taking your audio and compressing. I literally don't know a better way to describe it. I feel like it's one of those things where once you see it and you hear it, you'll kind of understand. So let's start by, I guess, talking about it. So here's this little drum break that I have. Same one that was playing in the intro. And as you can see at the bottom, I brought in a couple compressors. All of them are turned off right now, so there's no compression on any of these samples. So I'm going to start with the basic compressor that is built into Ableton. All of these are built into Ableton, but this is like the most simple one. And I'm going to turn it on. Now, there's kind of two modes that you can look at the compressor like interface as. I guess there's three modes, but there's two modes that I feel are the most useful. There's this mode here where you can see the waveform. If you're looking at the compressor, you can see the waveform kind of at the bottom in gray. And then if you click on the three bars that look kind of like a statistics menu, there's also this interface. This is the one that I use more, but I kind of switch between the two. And there's also this interface here I find this one confusing for some reason, so I do not use it. But yeah. But basically, right now, I don't think there's very much happening to the audio, compression-wise. But what I can do is I can take this threshold meter, and if I start dragging it down, you'll see where it says GR, you can see the orange bar kind of come up. And if you listen to the sound, it sounds a little more flat. Where there used to be those really loud transients where you heard the kick drum really loud and the hi-hat really kind of quiet, all of the sound kind of sounds more flattened in a way, in volume. So that's kind of what compression does, is it's taking all of the parts of your audio and like the same way, like, I don't know, it's just like making all of the sections kind of a similar loudness. And obviously you don't want it to sound like this, because this sounds like shit. So, you know, not really the optimal sound, but compression is useful in certain circumstances to kind of get certain things to pop. So I also have an example here from a vocal, which I think is from a reel that they
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned,
I don't know whose voice this is. I'm assuming
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do
this is Joseph's, maybe? Not really entirely sure.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
But I'm going to add a compressor, and I'm going to do the same thing with threshold.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before, in EQ, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll.
Do you notice how all of the, well, first of all, the audio gets quieter, and I'll explain that in a second, but
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
let's hear, I'm going to turn it on and off so you can hear the difference.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before, in EQ, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before, in EQ.
This is on.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
All of the sound is kind of like smushed and like flattened into one kind of bed, you know what I'm saying? Not explaining it very well, but I think this diagram might help you to understand. So the blue bar here is the threshold.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to
and this orange is what is how it's forcing the compressor to react to the audio.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll.
So what you can see
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to
is wherever there's a peak in the gray section at the bottom of the audio, the compressor is ducking that audio. And every time that there's a kind of quieter section, the compressor is raising that audio, the gain of that audio. And that's because of this threshold meter. The lower I put the threshold, you can barely even hear the audio anymore, but the more dramatic you can kind of see the image gets from what the compressor is doing. So right now it's pronouncing all of the silent moments between the person's speech, and it's ducking all of the sounds, like the louder sounds when the person is talking. And obviously this is not kind of what you want, but this basically lets you like flatten some of your sound. So if you have some harshness, if you want to maybe bring out like a quieter section, like you want to pronounce like the quieter sections in between like a vocal or whatever, it's kind of helpful for that, I guess. But all of it.
The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna
So I'm gonna go back
off
to the other
low
view.
end.
If I
And the reason we do that,
remove
again,
the
as I
threshold
mentioned
lower. So what you're noticing is like the audio is continually getting ducked where the person's speaking, and it's getting boosted where the person isn't speaking or in the quieter moments. So to be able to hear the same audio at the same volume, you can use this makeup gain kind of section, which is the out bar.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going
if you
to
just
roll
drag
off
it up.
the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before, in EQ, The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
So kind of a little louder, more audible. The threshold is also reactive to this ratio knob. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to reduce the ratio to 1.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to...
Sorry, this is going to be very loud. I apologize.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
Now I'm going to increase the ratio.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before...
You can hear how much more compressed the sound is, whereas if I reduce the ratio to basically nothing, to 1 to 1.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we...
This is basically just the original audio again. Whereas the higher the ratio...
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off
kind of the
low
more
end.
compression
and
is
the reason we
happening
do that, again, as I
audio.
mentioned before...
And then this is
in
infinity to 1.
The first thing
So
we're
this
going to do
is the
is we're going
highest
to roll off
that your
the low
compressor
end.
can go.
And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before...
And this is the lowest
in
your compression
EQ.
can go, is 1 to 1.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to...
Basically the compression is not active. The compressor is not active, I mean.
The first thing we're going to do...
There's also attack and release. So this is affecting how fast... Attack is basically affecting how fast the compressor is reacting to your audio and like ducking the sound or boosting the sound. And release is saying how long, when it gets to a certain state of ducking or boosting, is it going to take to go from that state to the next state. So if I increase the attack, or sorry, decrease the attack, and I turn back on maybe this mode here,
the first thing we're going to do is we're
you
going
can
to
see it's perfectly reactive
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low
to
end.
the audio.
And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before...
Whereas when I
in
increase
EQ,
the attack,
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
you can see, and it's kind of hard because the compressor's moving, so it's hard for me to talk over this person already talking.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off
but you can
the
see
low end.
it's kind of like more sloped. It takes some time for the compressor to get to the point where it wants to get, basically, where it's either taking a longer time to duck the audio or a longer time to boost the audio or whatever.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And
So
the
this
reason we
is
do
with
that,
the attack
again, as I mentioned before,
as low as
in
possible.
EQ,
And this
the
is
first
with
thing
the
we're going to do
attack
is we're
as
going
high
to
as
roll
possible.
off the low end. And the
And
reason
you
we
can
do
see
that,
the
again, as I
difference in
mentioned
the
before...
compressor. It's not a waveform, but it's the amount that it's ducking or boosting audio. So I'm going to set this back to its original attack, and then I'll show you what release does. So if the release is really long,
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
you can see it
And
takes
the reason we do
really,
that,
really
again,
long
as I mentioned
time
before,
for the audio to
in EQ,
change, the
first thing we're gonna do is we're
compressor
gonna
to
roll off
change
the low end.
the amount
the
of
reason we do
compression
that,
it's doing.
again, as I
Whereas if
mentioned
the release
before,
is as
in
low as
EQ,
possible,
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off
it's
the low end.
going incredibly fast. It's incredibly reactive to the audio, if that makes sense. So all of these things allow you to kind of fine tune your compression to be better sounding. Because something like this
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
is not really,
And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before,
like, you're not doing much to the audio in terms of compression. You're just making it kind of sound quieter overall, and then gain boosting it. It's not really doing anything. Whereas when you have the release kind of faster,
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again,
it's more the compressor is more reactive. The compressor is more reactive to the audio. I'm so sorry, guys. It's been a really long day. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing with this loop. I'm going to compress it. And let's drag down. So I'm going to now turn the compressor off and on so you can hear the difference. So right now it's on, and I'm going to turn it off. And now back on. Now it's really subtle in this one. Maybe it would be less subtle in the drum break because there's more quiet moments. I'll turn the compressor on and let me... This is the compressor on. this off. And back on. Do you see how the transience of the kick drum is less like aggressive, and you can hear more of that kind of white noise in between? You can hear more of the hi-hat, you can hear more of the snare. That's what that compressor is doing. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense right now. I'm gonna look at my notes quickly to see if I am missing anything so far. Are there any questions in the chat? Yo, shout out Aqua Music. Shout out. Hope you're enjoying the stream. Okay. So, yeah, that's kind of the basics. Now this is a really aggressive compression, and it doesn't really sound very good, but this is just for example purposes. If you want a more subtle compression, you might turn down the ratio, you might decrease the attack, increase the release. So now you can hear a little more of that in between sounds, like the hi-hat, the kind of white noise, even the breath at the end because it's a sample. But the kick is a little more quiet and less pronounced. Which it depends on what you're going for. It depends on what you're doing. For a lot of vocals, compression is incredibly important because, especially when you're working in a mix with like a million different layers and you want your vocals to pop, the first thing you should do is EQ, obviously, but then compression kind of helps you to get a certain level of like emphasis on certain parts of the words that might be getting drowned out in the sound, the parts of words that are a little more quiet than others. This is kind of like helping to compress the sounds and make everything an audible volume, I guess, if that makes sense. So I'm going to talk about a different type of compressor, which is the multiband compressor. So this normal compressor is interesting because I guess not interesting, but this normal compressor is working with the entire range of sounds. It's compressing the entire range of sounds, of frequencies. My fault. The multiband compressor is compressing very specific ranges of frequencies. So it has a high, mid, and low range of frequencies, which can be defined with this section here. These sliders here, which are basically defining like which frequencies are considered low versus high versus whatever. So right now, low is defined as 120 hertz, and high is defined as 2.5 kilohertz. And then mid is the frequencies in between those two, basically. So 120 hertz to 2.5 kilohertz. So if I decide I want to add compression to just the high end, let's say, you could just increase the Actually, me when I'm stupid. Give me 1 sec, guys. Okay, my fault. So yeah, right now, if you only want to compress the mid-range, you can just select just the mid-range, and you can compress it by changing the attack, the release. It's increasing the volume, but yeah. And then this is the high end. It allows you to compress all of the ranges of audio, but only in like 3 separate channels, I guess. So this is the high end. This is basically just the hi-hat, and you can just say how you want to affect the audio. So I'm going to turn off the compressor. This is the original sound, and this is it with the multiband. And again, this is just me like fooling around with it. A lot of it is just like fooling around with the settings and like working to your ear, I guess, and like your own instincts of what sounds good. Obviously, there's like some baseline things with compression. Like you don't want to over compress something. Like this is kind of very compressed. Like this is not it doesn't sound good. You don't want to over compress a sound because compression like is often changing like the character of a sound. Like that's like what it's doing. And so oftentimes when you're mixing or whatever, you want to keep the same character of the sound, the same timbre and everything, but you want to compress just for mixing purposes or whatever. But again, or you can compress for vibes, which is what I do a lot of the times. I just compress to vibes because I think it's more fun. Okay, and then there's this final compressor that's really big. I mean, there's a bunch of presets, by the way, so if you go to your audio effects and you check under dynamics, that's where all the compressors are. There's all of these things, and you can just like grab a random one and bring it on and hear what it sounds like. This one didn't even let me lower the threshold. This one didn't even do nothing. Okay, wait. Let me get a crazy one for you. Let's get loud kneeless. Let's see. Wow. Beautiful. There's also a de-esser. This de-esser kind of sucks. But what it does, or what it's supposed to do, is take out all of the sibilants, the like s and like breathing and whatever, those type of sounds from your mic. They get picked up in very like harsh. They're very harsh frequencies when you record them. All of the sounds. So the de-esser is supposed to make those softer. This de-esser is pretty shit. It doesn't do a great job. Let's hear if this...
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before...
there's some harsh sibilants, but it's not that bad.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before in EQ... the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before...
I feel like it's not doing it. It's just like compressing the audio. It's not really working as a de-esser. But there are like free de-essers. I use one called like T de-esser. That's super important when you're doing vocals. It's a basic type of compression that like targets a certain frequency range. It's basically a multiband, like it's basically just like only compressing the frequency range that all of the sounds kind of land in. And that's really important because sometimes if you're listening to a song and you hear one really sharp S, or any like audio recording, and you hear like a really sharp S, sometimes I like focus on that. Every time there's an S, I'm like, oh my god, these S's are coming through like crazy. Maybe that's just because I'm, brain broken a little bit, but yeah. Okay, I want to talk about OTT because it's my favorite compressor because it's so fun. I love having fun. So OTT sounds like this, and this is going to be pretty loud, so I apologize. Whoa. Isn't this crazy, guys? Crazy. OTT. OTT. Yeah, it's just an Ableton, built-in Ableton preset. But it kind of became... Sorry, I'm going to mute my phone because people keep texting me. Goddamn. It kind of became like a phenomenon, I guess, especially in like dubstep circles, I think, and like electronic music circles. and there's now plugins that basically are OTT. But I think it started as an Ableton preset, if I'm correct. I could be completely wrong, and it's the other way around, so that's my fault. But basically, OTT is just a really intense compressor. It basically compresses everything until like nothing is really like noticeable anymore. Like if I do it on the vocal, it's kind of interesting.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before,
like it's such an intense compressor. Like all of the sounds in between get really
off the low end, and
like all of the noise in between gets really compressed. It sounds like I don't know. It reminds me of like I don't know, YouTube tutorials from like early YouTube. You know what I'm saying? Like it has that kind of vibe. And it's often used in like electronic music, obviously, but then it doesn't really have just that purpose. Like there's some really intense compression on, like, for example, I don't know if anyone is familiar, but like the Mike album, there's a song on there called Should Be, the new Mike record. I forget what it's called now, Burning Desire. But the song is called Should Be, but even across most of the record. But I think he just put an OTT on the instrumental, or maybe even the master, just a really intense compressor, and it sounds beautiful. So it's all really just like how you use this effect that makes it useful. Yeah, but I love it because it's so fun. Let me put it on this one. Let's hear what it sounds like. I just love how like noisy it kind of makes everything, because all sounds kind of have this underlying noise, I guess. Like all recorded sounds have this underlying noise from your room, from whatever, and it kind of highlights all of those in between parts of the sound, which is really fun, I think. Okay, the last thing or not the last thing, but I'm gonna touch on compression now.
The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna
oh my god, sorry. So we have these two layers, the drum and this audio loop. I'm going to show you what sidechain is. So if you go to compressor, and you go to side and you click this arrow button next to it, you can click sidechain, and then you can choose an input of another track. So I'm going to choose the drum break sample track. And then let's play it back. Oh my god, sorry. I'm so sorry, everybody. So what is it doing? Can you guys hear that? Every time an audio signal plays in this, every time there's a loud audio signal in this layer gets ducked. Do you notice how every beat or every 2 beats it's ducking the audio a little bit? Because that's when the kick and the snare hit in the other audio file. So let's play that together. Oh my god, sorry. So that sounds pretty weird, but what it's normally used for is for kicks, letting the kick. It's usually used in a lot of like electronic music and hip hop. I honestly, low-key, am a compression hater, sidechain hater. It doesn't mean it's bad always. Oh my god, that's an intense kick. Oh my god, why are these all so intense? Oh my god. Let's use this one, Powerpuff Kick. I'm just gonna loop this a bunch. Now I'm gonna change the input to the compressor is reacting to the signal from the kick, the kick track. My gosh, guys, it's been such a long day. And it's ducking the audio of the other track. So what's happening is it's taking input from, we set our input to track 4, and track 5 is being affected by the volume, the transients, whatever. So if I go to, you can kind of hear it. Let me increase the release a little bit. Oh my gosh. Guys, just said if I wanted to enable dictation. I don't know how to use a Mac. I keep forgetting the control button is different than the command button. Ugh. But you can hear the kick kind of comes through more, because the kick is ducking audio from the other file, or from the other track. That's what sidechain does, is it takes the audio signal from one track and it uses it as a compressor to affect when the audio ducks on another track. And it's useful for letting things kind of come through the mix. It's often a stylistic thing. It's not used to like fix a mix oftentimes. It's used as like a stylistic choice in a lot of electronic music, again, hip hop, whatever. There are people who, like, I'm not a sidechain hater. I have like a complicated relationship with it, I guess. It's like 50-50. Sometimes it's cool, sometimes it's like, I'm like, really? Did you have to sidechain that? And sometimes it makes a mix muddy when you don't know what you're doing. Like, this is really muddy. This sounds absolutely terrible. Like, this is bad. It's a bad example, but you know. But it's all about using it correctly. Like, it's all about using it in the correct contexts. And so for some music, if it's like a 4 on the floor beat and you really want that kick to come through, sometimes even like grouping all of the tracks into one layer and then sidechaining everything with that kick, sometimes that could totally hit. But you know, it depends on what vibe you're going for. But sidechain is basically it's like, yeah, it's like a fun like technique that you can use to kind of make things pop out of your mix a little better. The last thing I want to talk about is gates. So what is a gate? Gate is an effect. So if I go here, go to gate. Sorry. Back to the audio file. Let me turn off the gate.
The thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
I'm just going to,
and the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before in EQ, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before in EQ, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason...
So the gate is basically setting a certain threshold similar to compression where audio is able to come through, and if it doesn't hit that threshold, no audio can come through. So let's play this again.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll...
So you can actually not hear almost anything because the threshold is too high. So let me lower the threshold a little more.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end.
So right now you're hearing it's really choppy. That's because when this person is speaking, I'm just going to assume this is Joseph. I think it is. When Joseph is speaking,
the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off
all of the quieter sections in between words, or even when he's saying part of a word but it's a little quieter than the syllable before, are not hitting above the threshold, which is set right now at, it looks like, -24 dB. Once anything that goes over the threshold is going to be audible. Now this is really useful when you're going through a track and you know you have somewhat consistent levels between like what you're saying or whatever, but there is a lot of noise in between. All of the times that you stop saying something, all of the times you take a breath, there's a lot of noise coming through, and you want to just remove those breaths, you want to remove that noise. this can help to fix some of those problems. Is you set a threshold that is low enough that your audio that you want to have, like your vocal or whatever, can come through, but high enough that the noise cannot come through. So let me lower the threshold a little more.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before.
So right now we're almost there. So I feel like the threshold is low enough, but what's happening is it's being very reactive. So every time there's even like half a syllable that goes under the threshold, it's being cut off. So what you can do is you can lower what's called the return. So this says basically when the threshold is above a certain point, when something has passed the threshold, then the audio has to be below the return before it no more audio comes through and audio gets cut.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before in EQ.
So this is already a little more, it's still not perfect. It's still very intense. So what you can do now is you can change the release. So if I increase the release, it's similar to compression. Increasing the release means, oh, we're going to stay a little longer. The effect is going to stay a little longer, I guess. It's basically saying like we're going to take longer to, it's like a less aggressive gate. I didn't explain that very well at all. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm so tired.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before in EQ.
So do you see this yellow bar? I'm going to want you to look at the yellow bar. Because the release is really low, what's happening is it's ducking slower than it normally would. Whereas if the release was quicker, the duck would happen like immediately.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before in
Do you see that? So I'm like, do you see that? Like, it's so exciting, but it's just literally a gate.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll off the low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before in EQ.
So that's much better than before, because this is kind of the sound before.
The low end. And the reason we do...
You can kind of hear very quietly in the background.
The low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before.
All of the kind of very subtle, noisy sections in between, I turn on the gate.
The low end. And the reason we do that, again, as I mentioned before.
Now everything in this section here, gets cut out. Whereas if I wanted to cut out the section before, I'd literally go here and click delete, and then I'd be changing all of the fades, and I'd be doing blah, blah. But this just lets you, this just lets you kind of play with some settings.
The first thing we're going to do...
And then it gives you a decent audio output without those sections in between, without the breaths, without the noise. Yeah, that's what a gate does. Yeah, I hope that is good. I hope that I explained everything well. Looks like there's one viewer. Does anyone have any questions or wants to say anything in the chat? I'm so sorry, guys. I really tried today. I'm just really exhausted. I don't know why. I wasn't able to explain things probably to the best of my ability. But wow, there's a car outside. If I had a gate on my mic, then you guys wouldn't have been able to hear that car. I'm bringing it all back around to the lesson. Yeah, I guess there's no questions. So I guess that's it on compression and sidechaining. Again, I hope this helped. Yeah, this was an interesting stream for sure. Yeah, I guess that's it. If there's no questions, I'm going to end the stream. And I want to say that tomorrow there's going to be an event at QWave. You can check out our Instagram for more information about it. But it's going to be basically a little cook up with everybody in QWave or anybody who attends the event. So check our Instagram and you can find that information there. I hope this tutorial was at least a little bit helpful, and I'm sorry I wasn't explaining things very well. I'm very a little out of it. It's been a really long week. Okay. I hope everyone has a great week. And then I think next week it's either Joseph or Yusuf who's doing the tutorials. So yeah, I'll see you in a couple weeks then. All right.